Hello and welcome to Future Procurement. Today we talk to Margaret Gilbert from New Zealand. Hello, Margaret.
Hello there, how are you?
And Margaret is a procurement consultant and trainer and author of Contract Matters books covering procurement. Yeah, Margaret is on direct Skype now from New Zealand, 12 hours from me.
Yes.
And we will discuss...
It's challenging, isn't it?
There's challenges, it's really fun. And today we discuss sourcing strategy, right, Margaret?
That's right, yeah.
And we are giving the best practice on sourcing strategy. So, Margaret, can you say in general, maybe as a good starting point, and last talk about best practice, we were talking about procurement strategy. Maybe yes. You can, from the very beginning, take away, I'm sure there will be many questions like, what's the difference, procurement strategy and sourcing strategy? Maybe we can start with elaborating on this question.
Sure. Okay. A procurement strategy looks at the big picture of what procurement is about looking forward into the future. And sourcing strategy is looking, it's quite simple really in terms of a source and about the concept of sourcing, and that is being aware of the available suppliers out there in the marketplace and being able to do the homework so that when you need them for whatever procurement that you're trying to do, is that you've actually sort of have a way of finding them and knowing what they can do. Business suppliers, of course. Sourcing, everyone thinks sourcing is difficult, but sourcing should be done, I believe, should be done on about a 1 hour per week basis so that you've got an idea of available suppliers, and the more you do the 1 hour per week, the less time you'll have to do later when you are looking for a particular type of supplier. So rather than having to spend an awful lot of hours, if you do short-term kind of work on it, it becomes easier to do it that way. So there is a difference in terms of a procurement strategy and a sourcing strategy, only in that if you find available suppliers and obtain information, and then you've got a better knowledge in terms of what suppliers can do, then that makes it easy. And then you file that information, then you can put, when you need it for next time, is that it's there. If you don't put the work in, and your life becomes much harder.
At work.
Yes.
In general, your life can be still okay.
Yes.
No, I'm joking. So we should. I'm always saying that when people say that life gets harder or it's very tough life or whatever, I mean it's work. Don't
yes.
Forget.
Don't
that
stress out over it too much. Yeah.
I'm becoming a little bit philosophical after some of these hard discussions. That I should remember that it's work.
Yes,
sorry for a little bit side comment.
No, that's fine. Where it can get difficult and it depends on whether there is plentiful suppliers, as in there's lots of them, or whether they're limited, and so therefore obviously only say about 2 or 3 or 4, or whether it's sole source. And to my mind, and best...
Also, sorry? I will just give a short... we also often say single sourcing, and sole sourcing is the same.
Okay.
It's just
about same thing.
Vocabulary because I'm more used to the word single sourcing, but it's fine.
Okay. Supplier meaning only one.
Yeah. That's what we mean. Okay.
Just to clarify. Yeah. And to my mind, if you are operating with sole source or single supplier for a particular product or service, that's even more reason to keep on sourcing on a regular basis, because you've just got to think about it from the perspective of control and power. Because if it's a sole source or single supplier scenario, then the power is not with you, even from a buyer side of things. So it's a good, for short term, then that's fine if it's a sole source type scenario. But if it's going to go on over a period of time, it's not a good place to be. And that's why it's a good idea to keep on sourcing, so that if there are any new players out there, is that you can find out about them. So you have more control, because the concept about multiple suppliers is about comparison. And so if you've got multiple suppliers, you can compare product or service or whatever else is important to you. But if there's only one, then you can be in a situation where they can increase their pricing and you don't have much choice in the matter.
Good
so one way in terms of best practice is just to keep on sourcing and to see if there are other type players out there, supplier players out there, so that you can have more control. And frankly, having control is a good thing in terms of knowing that there is, availability, certainty of supply, and of course, talking about single source or sole source, what happens if they fell over and went away, so to speak? Where would you be then?
Yeah. So it's one thing is connected to risk management, another thing can be connected to encouraging competition and enabling competition. Right. So it's both cost and risk, and of course there can be many more aspects if we think deeper about it, of course.
Yes, that's true. And so from a best practice perspective, is the idea is to have, or find if you can, multiple suppliers rather than a sole source or limited. But it's a case of, if you do have a sole source or a single source, is your contract management side of things is going to have to be different, obviously, because they are then become a strategic contract. And you need to treat strategic contracts differently. That's getting off topic from sourcing, but it's relevant because and you mentioned the word risk, and I should have even said that myself. I'm sorry if I didn't use the word risk, but your risk increases with the less number of suppliers that you have. Yeah. So. And people say to me, I don't have time to do 1 hour per week. And sometimes you've just got to find that hour because it just makes your life harder later on if you don't, and then having to spend multiple hours.
So if you can elaborate about this 1 hour a little bit deeper, how would this look like? I mean, how would this hour look like?
Well, the easiest way to do it is to sort of say, okay, well, I'm going to put aside 1 hour per week, and it's going to be a Friday from 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock in the day, as an example. And so that is your time for actually actively sourcing. Yeah. And it's whether it's through the internet, whether it's through trade publications, whether it's through people who knock on your door and want to see you. Whatever the way it is, then that 1 hour is useful. So it might be a good idea if I actually sort of expanded somewhat about this knock on your door scenario. When I was a buyer, I had suppliers knocking on my door every second day. Okay. They didn't have appointments necessarily. They just thought they would rock up and sort of see if it was possible. And yes, it is a little painful, but the concept is that my concept is that invite them and listen to them, take the information that they had with them. Then you would know about them. You could file it in your filing cabinet. So next time you needed something on widgets or whatever the case may be, is that you could put your hand to the information. And the other thing about meeting prospective suppliers is, from a best practice perspective, is you can weigh up whether they're worth worrying about or not, if they've got value or they don't, whether you can use the information or you don't, whether in fact you could sort of provide or contract with them for a small contract to see whether they're capable of doing what they say. And so then later on you can sort of say, upgrade, so to speak, to larger size contracts, rather than making a commitment of a large contract initially without being totally confident that they can do what they say they can do. Okay. So our best practice is to sort of provide something to them that's smallish, that's controllable if it went wrong, and go from there.
Good advice.
So I just assumed, since that most buyers had suppliers knocking on the door every second day. If they don't, well, I wonder why. Could it be that suppliers don't want to deal with you? And of course, most of us don't like to think that's the case, but sometimes you've got to have to ask a question. Well, why aren't I getting phone calls from prospective suppliers? Well,
It's an interesting question. I mean, how to maybe a short, small version, let's say, of advice for making yourself more visible for your suppliers. How would you do it, and what are maybe a few bullet point advice you would give to make yourself a little bit more visible, or to make people, because maybe sometimes people just don't know about you enough.
That's right.
Or about your needs.
Yes. Well, maybe part of a strategy can be is to sort of have an open day, open hour, open lunch hour, whatever, and invite suppliers to come in and have a chat with you. And say, or put it out there in terms of the intranet that, put it out that goes out to the public, is we're interested in, part of your procurement plan for the upcoming year is saying we're interested in this type of procurement, please get in touch.
Okay.
Because in my neck of the woods, government agencies especially have to do a procurement plan for the upcoming 12 months.
Oh, good.
And that's useful to do from the perspective of that can get suppliers geared up, so to speak, so that they'll be ready for when the tender goes out.
Exactly.
Yeah. You've just got to put it around your people, and if and I got to say, and New Zealand is quite small. I mean, we've only got a population of 4.5 million, right? It's a small population. Everyone knows each other. It's almost like, forget about the 6 degrees of separation. It's more like 3 degrees of separation. And so all you've got to do is put it out there, and it gets around. And and then you might. The problem with that is, of course, is then you can get inundated with suppliers who want to come talk to you. But as I said, that's not a bad thing either.
No.
Yeah. I don't know what in your neck of the woods, but that's what happens here, as well as Australia, of course, which is our closest neighbour. You need to be proactive. You can't just sit, just like you can't. Okay. There's two things to this. Procurement people are very good at sitting and waiting for others to come to them. And that's from both within the internal perspective, for your organisational colleagues to come and talk to you. I believe that we need to go out to the organisation. And so if we make this relevant to the sort of what we're talking about here, is that sometimes you've got to sort of get yourself known to the suppliers. Yeah. Go and do site visits. Go and pay them a visit.
Yeah. And that's actually the advice that I can give. And this gives me personally a lot of energy, a lot of powerful insights when you visit suppliers, when you see the way they, if it's production, the way they produce, for example, and this gives immediately some ideas about potential savings, for example, when you understand deeper their production processes, when you understand deeper their constraints and limitations. And we were talking about negotiations some episodes ago, and of course when you visit them, when you talk to them, you really can feel their points where they have let's call it pains, or when they have really constraints, and the things that can be not so appreciated or valuable by you, for you. These things can be a big issues for them. And when we were talking about negotiations, we were talking about concessions, right? So
we were.
Small concession from your side can make a big difference for them in terms of price, in terms of risk, or whatever. So, I mean, supplier visit, very good advice, and please don't underestimate it. Invest some of your time, and it's really investment of time. Because for sure, every supplier visit gives you another angle, another new opportunity.
Insight, suppliers like to think that they're good at what they are, they're good at what they do, and all the rest of it. And and if they and recognition is always sort of will be your bonus later on, because they'll just want to do better work for you. You've got to, and we've been talking about this over the last several episodes in terms of the relationship and the importance of the relationship, and the more that you involve, the more that you are inclusive, the more that becomes we rather than them and us, the better. But that's getting away a little bit from sourcing in terms of finding new suppliers. But as I said, when in my day, as I said, you didn't have to go looking too far because they came to you in terms of knocking on the door saying, please, we want to talk to you. If we turn this around in terms of the supplier side, if you are a sole source or a single source supplier, or even a limited or normal, plentiful suppliers, they need to, and from best practice perspective, they need to treat those meetings differently. They need to, rather than because they'll ring you up and they say we'd like to come and see you in a couple of weeks, and then they're not clear about what they want to say to you when they get there. So they're sitting in front of you, and then it's almost like, you have to lead it because they all of a sudden are a bit dumbstruck that they're there and they don't have their key messages or clarity around what they want to say to you. I found that very frustrating when I was a buyer, to have a supplier sitting in front of me after wanting to come and see me and then sort of didn't have a clear path in terms of how they wanted that discussion to go.
Yeah.
And so when I talk to suppliers, I say to them, get in touch, make a time, be prepared, provide information, follow up from after the meeting by email or whatever the case may be, be proactive. And by doing that, you become the front of the buyer mind, so to speak, so that they'll remember you for next time. So it's helpful to provide the buyer with information, although they should know a bit of information if they've already sort of done a sourcing and done some a Google check or whatever the case may be and sort of found out about them yourself. But it's information that you can copy and keep and place on file. And I'm talking about a manual file here, rather than an electronic file. I always find paper trail stuff, paper filing stuff to be extremely helpful.
Yeah.
You can just put your hand on it and whatever, rather than what happens if you have a techie meltdown or whatever the case may be. That's not helpful for you. So if in fact you're using a new supplier is that you've just met and you're trying to test out in terms of a small contract first, now, if it works, that's great, and then you have confidence to be able to move that along. If they can't meet and manage a small contract, then perhaps you've just got to put them in the pile that says can't undertake the services that we need. But in terms of a sourcing strategy, is that you really need to be able to find multiple sources. You need to be able to put in the work and put in the effort, and it will come and be helpful for you later.
Yeah, good. How would you recommend to keep the track of these records? Is there any advice for supplier portfolio, managing it in a better way?
What I used to do is keep a manual folder with, as I said, with supplier information. Keep it in my filing cabinet, which would be in my office, and so you can always put your hand to it when you needed it. Keep it close to hand. And sometimes you probably need to, if it doesn't work out, then put them in the no pile, a bit like evaluation really. But equally is that maybe you need to, on a regular basis, once a year perhaps, cull that file as to, okay, I don't have a need for, or yes I do, or stuff like that. And if we put the supplier hat on for a moment, if you're going to pay a visit to a buyer and provide them with information, then provide them with information about all the services that you provide, right? So it could be a case that the buyer then goes, well, I don't need that, but I need this or this or this. And, I didn't know these guys did this. So, the more information that you can provide to the buyer, the better it is.
Exactly.
But primarily, if we turn it around from the buyer side of things, is that it's in their best interest to find multiple suppliers or multiple sources, because choice and comparison and all that good stuff.
Great.
Now, the other thing about it, there's two ways of doing this, is that you can meet some suppliers, especially if they're local. But, of course, if they're not local or whatever, then you can't necessarily meet with them, but a phone call wouldn't go amiss. So that's where you spend your hour on a weekly basis. Is make that phone call, read that information, think about procurement going forward in terms of what you need for the next period of time, and do you have enough sufficient suppliers that you can go, okay, put it on the bid list or put it out on your electronic tendering system that exists in countries, and and do it that way.
Yeah, and this is actually my next question about electronic tendering, about e-procurement. How would you treat this category of supplier or this category of products or services that you can do with e-procurement? Sourcing strategy for these ones, what it requires, and what can be tricky in this one?
Within domestically within your own country, or further afield?
I'm saying in general, so of course I also mean the international contract.
Okay, well, domestically it's kind of reasonably simple because you can have an idea about, from talking with other people or whatever, or just doing the research, is that you can know whether they can do or not. And if you live in a small country like I do, then, as I said, it doesn't take much to get around of those good suppliers versus the bad suppliers, right? If you're looking at doing e-procurement from an international perspective, that produces problems in its own right, because you've got to have a fair bit degree of trust in terms of sort of saying, okay, you know sufficient information that you can go ahead and contract with that party. Probably have to put in extra protections and all the rest of it, I guess, because when you contract internationally, there are differences there than when you contract domestically. For example, like currency, like legal jurisdiction, like logistics, like distance, like exchange rate, etc., etc.
Okay.
And you've got to hope that your techie platform is the same both ends, if you know what I mean.
Exactly.
And the other thing is that sometimes the best suppliers might be, if you're looking at it from an international perspective, could come from countries that don't have a very well-defined e-procurement scenario because of lack of infrastructure, for example.
Yeah.
When I talk infrastructure, I mean power. And if countries where there's poor power infrastructure, then e-procurement isn't going to work for you, because there's no guarantee that from one minute to the next there is stable power. And I discovered that when I worked in Ghana. I hope I should.
Yeah.
And their power supply was just iffy from one minute to the next. So e-procurement isn't going to work in that type of environment.
But also
there has to be some security around this to ensure that there are some protections and stuff, of course.
Okay, so this is kind of extreme example you have given, but still it happens. I mean, it's worth considering.
Well, to be honest, it's not too extreme at all, because there are countries like Africa and parts of Asia and the Pacific that is a common issue.
Yeah.
That's why when I've been talking to you over this number of weeks now about one size doesn't fit all, has to be fit for purpose, is that, that doesn't work, because how we do things in the West doesn't necessarily work outside in developing countries, shall we say. We're moving a little bit away from sourcing strategy, but
I was thinking about this e-procurement, just to finalize on this one. My biggest concern every time doing e-procurement is about the requirements, and will the requirements will be understood the same with all the potential suppliers or from this particular tender, because especially if it is international, but even if it is domestic, I mean, you should really make sure to specify the things deeply enough and in enough detail.
What's important for you, and making sure that it's sort of everyone plays by the same rules, so to speak. Yeah.
So just what I want to say, that with even with e-procurement, which sounds to be so simple and easygoing, I mean, still be aware about the requirements. Be aware about that all suppliers should understand the requirements in the same way.
Yes.
And
yes.
also make sure, like you said, that some of the points can be either forgotten, either different in the counterparty, or the total cost of ownership. You will not include some of the taxes if it's international trade, or some of the custom duties, or
or whether it's GST or VAT or whatever the tax sort of scenario is in specific countries, right? Yeah. Well, there also has to be certainty that the information that in terms of uploading or whatever mechanism it is in terms of your technology or e-procurement is secure as well, secure and safe.
Good. Coming back now to sourcing strategy in a full speed.
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of best practice, if we think about it, there needs to be ongoing sourcing, and you need to be able to compare the information you've got from one supplier to the next. You should welcome phone contact and/or someone knocking on your door and saying, "Can we talk with you?" And the concept should be, from best practice, is to move away from sole source suppliers if you can. Because choice is always the best way to do procurement, and so you can compare and have clarity and know that you can evaluate clearly. The other thing is you need to ask questions as well. So another way of doing sourcing is that, as I said, you can invite suppliers to come in, or when you do a specific procurement, you can do what I call a pre-bid conference, and that means after the tender's gone out or the RFP's gone out and before proposal responses come in, is to do a pre-bid conference, and that way you can do an educative thing of all suppliers, and the word will get around that that you are welcome to hearing from more new suppliers. So I always found it useful to meet with suppliers and to gain information, and so you had a direction going forward. And having a forward positive direction when it comes to sourcing is a good thing. especially if it's highly technical, especially if it is sort of something that's important. And I mentioned before about those sole source or single source suppliers treating as a strategic contract. Maybe as a part of best practice, I could mention the concept of a strategic contract. Would you find that useful? Yeah. Alrighty. So a strategic contract is one that if the supplier went away or fell over or for whatever other reason was no longer there, it was going to cause a direct influence on your organisation bottom line. Now that is a strategic contract, so you need to treat differently. Yeah. Then if there was a supplier that there were many suppliers, in other words, if they fell over or went away or whatever, you can go to the next one and down the block, so to speak.
Yeah.
And when I talk to both buyer and supplier about strategic contracts, they go, "Oh, I've got strategic contracts. I've got a couple of hundred." And the answer is, no, you don't. No. You've probably only got about 4 or 5 that are truly strategic. So you've got to recognise which of your contracts are strategic, and then treat them a little differently in terms of contract management side of things.
Very good point.
Yeah. So all I can do is recommend that buyers just take that time, continually source, and it will save you time in the long run. And there is a difference between a procurement strategy and a sourcing strategy. Yeah.
Great.
In terms of the relevant contract matters book, and we're talking about strategic contracts, yes. Would be contract matters, strategic contracts, contract strategies. That's the relevant contract matters book.
Thank you so much for
right.
This great summary and the best practice on sourcing strategy. And thank you, dear listener, for being with us until the very end of this episode of our podcast. keep on listening to the best practice and to other episodes of Future Procurement and staying with us. It is very important for us to build the community of like-minded people who want to develop their career, their organizations, and who want to move the world to be a better place using the Future Procurement best practice. Particular thank you to Margaret Gilbert for sharing her great experience with us, and we will keep on having these best practice episodes every second week. So stay tuned, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast, and of course give us your messages, your questions, your feedback via email info@futureprocurement.net or via social media. My name is Robert Freeman, and this was Future Procurement. We talk to you soon.